Hello everyone, I'm Gabriel. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Seville. In this paper, I will focus on the twin deficit hypothesis, if this twin deficit hypothesis works for sub-Saharan African countries. So coming to the introduction part, the twin deficit hypothesis argues that both the budget deficit and current account deficit or trade balance goes in the same direction. So theoretically, they argue that if there is persistently large trade deficit, it has a big problem to the country's economy, because countries' resources will go to foreigners and it will have a burden to future generation. On the other hand, if there is a persistently budget deficit in an economy, then this has also a problem to increasing public debt and its burden, and it has an inflationary effect. And if governments are borrowing more, then they will have less resources for the private sector, and it will have a crowding out of private effect. So this creates macroeconomic instabilities, and many researchers for the past 3 decades, they are focusing how to resolve these problems, and it becomes a policy agenda of many countries. And coming to sub-Saharan African countries are characterized by exporting many primary commodities, which are highly volatile economies. And this highly volatility has a problem in the current account balance and the budget deficit, because governments cannot earn stable income because also of the volatility, and the export and import relationship or the trade balance will have also an effect because of their exporting sector. So in this paper, I will focus on 2 issues. The first one is I will try to see if there is a long-run relationship between fiscal deficit and current account deficit. And the second one is if the twin deficit hypothesis also works for sub-Saharan African countries, is the second objective of this paper. Coming to the literature, in the theoretical literature, there are 3 arguments: twin deficit hypothesis, twin divergence hypothesis, and the Ricardian equivalence hypothesis. So in the twin deficit hypothesis, that we can have 2 arguments from the neo-Keynesian approach and neoclassical approach. From the neo-Keynesian approach, it argues that the income spending, Keynesian income spending approach, or the absorptive approach, because of if government increases its spending, then it will have in the demand side, it increases the income of consumers, and because of this consumption increases, and we call it as a domestic absorption. And this consumption increases, it demands many importers, and it will have an effect on the trade balance. And the neoclassical, with regard to twin deficit hypothesis, argues that if consumption increases, it will have an effect of interest rate, and it appreciates the real effective exchange rate, and many products or domestic products become expensive, and export decreases, and new inflow capital increases. And this will have also an effect with the trade balance of a country. However, the Ricardian equivalence argues that zero effect is like if government increases spending, because individuals assume that they will have, in the long run, taxation will increase, and they will increase their private savings. So government spending increases will be mitigated or offsetted by the private saving, and it will not have a relationship with the trade deficit approach. Then the other approach is a twin divergence approach, when government spending, like the fiscal deficit, increases and the trade deficit decreases, and this approach is known as twin divergence hypothesis. Coming to the empirical studies, we can have mainly in 5 results. The first one, they confirm the validity of the hypothesis. The second one, they also get the Ricardian equivalent hypothesis, and the third one also confirms the twin divergence hypothesis. And the fourth and the fifth one tries to show the grander causalities among the variables. So some studies found a unidirectional. It can be from current account to fiscal deficit, or from fiscal policy to current account deficit. So the relationship is one-way relationship, but the other papers also found like a bidirectional causalities, like if there is a trade deficit, and then it will have an effect on fiscal deficits, and at the same time, fiscal policy affects trade policy. So these have a bidirectional derivative, they say. So with data and methodology in this study, I use from 2000 up to 2018, 19 years data set for 18 sub-Saharan Africa countries. The data sources are from IMF and World Bank. So in my thesis, I took a theoretical framework and I took the current account deficit as a dependent variable and fiscal deficit as an independent variable. So I start if government increases spending at the beginning exogenously, then it has an effect on the interest rate, and this increases the capital inflow and appreciates the real effective exchange rate. Then finally, the domestic economy becomes less competitive in international market, and this will affect the trade deficit. This is a theoretical framework for my paper. And I took like fiscal deficit ratio, GDP ratio, real GDP, trade account balance, and real effective exchange rates were taken as variables for the analysis in this study. So from like national income account or the GDP in terms of expenditure approach, GDP is consumption, investment, government spending, net export is one approach of estimating GDP, and in the income approach, we can estimate GDP in terms of consumption, saving, and taxation. So if we equate these things and if it deletes the consumption aspects, then we'll get tax minus government expenditure is the budget deficit, this one is saving minus investment, and this one is export minus import is the trade balance. So in some papers recently, they were doing like the triple deficit hypothesis, then how it works as a triple deficit hypothesis. But in my case, I'm assuming that saving minus investment is in the long run, it is stable. So I will focus whether the twin deficit hypothesis works. If like the government budget deficit increases, then definitely the trade deficit will increase. So it will go like the same direction is. So I analyze my study using panel ARDL model. I apply the three models, DFE, MG, and PMG models. Based on the LR test, I will focus on my results on the DFE model, dynamic fixed effect models. And finally, for the Granger causality, whether there is a unidirectional or bidirectional model, I use the Dimitrescu and Herlin 2012 Granger causality test in my study. Coming to the results and discussion, I first checked whether there is cross-sectional dependence amongst the variables. So I found a cross-sectional dependence amongst the variables. So because of this, I use a second generation unit root test for the chips. So from my study, like real GDP was found stationary at a first difference, but the others were stationary at level. So, and I tried to check the co-integration, whether the variables have a long-run relationship or not, or whether they have short-run only. Then the co-integration test indicators that the variables have a long-run relationship. So due to this, I analyze the long-run relationship, and I'll focus on both the short-run and long-run results. So here, like at the beginning, it indicates the short-run relationship, and this one are the long-run relationships it indicated. Here is the error correction model, the adjustment rate, how the shocks can be adjusted in the long run. It says like 51% will be adjusted. Like the rate is like 51% is negative and significant. And this one is output is also significant in the short run. It affects the trade deficit. Then the other thing is the fiscal deficit has also a positive effect. So this indicates like if fiscal policy deficit increases and trade deficit increases. So it confirms the twin deficit hypothesis in the long run. And with regard to Granger causality, the direction, like which way of the direction, whether there is a bidirectional or unidirectional among the variables, I try to check the Granger causality first from trade balance to fiscal balance, and it confirms, like, it rejects the null hypothesis, and there is a granular causality from trade balance to fiscal balance. And the second one, I tried to check the granular causality from fiscal balance to trade balance, and in this case, it rejects the null, it accepts the null hypothesis. So in my case, I found that there is a unidirectional case for sub-Saharan African countries. So as a conclusion, like, I have found a positive effect relationship between budget deficit and current account deficit from the granular causality. The finding reveals that there is a feedback relationship between trade deficit to budget deficit. Then this, the third conclusion is this, for sub-Saharan African cases, twin deficit hypothesis works for sub-Saharan Africa countries. So as a conclusion of this study, mainly focuses, like, countries should have to focus on export promotion. They have to focus on the spillover effect of export promotion on, like, adjusting the budget deficit. So countries should have to focus on a drastic fiscal and trade sector reform for sub-Saharan Africa countries to bring efficiency in their markets. This is all about my presentation. If you have any questions, suggestions, you are welcome.